big fit last night. I'm going to be talking about SVG2 from maybe perspective of an artist or a developer who's interested in the new features that are going into it. And I think this year's talk is a little bit different from last year's talk in that you can start to see some implementation of some SVG2 things in the Inkscape and in the web browsers. And so I'm going to also not only show you the new things that are coming up, but give you an idea of the implementation state of those features. I don't think anybody here doesn't know what SVG vector graphics is. It's part of HTML5, but it's been around a lot longer. It's now supported by all the major browsers. From my perspective, or my importance to me, from Inkscape's perspective, it's Inkscape's native file format. So if you write out Inkscape files, you can immediately view them with only a few minor problems in the browsers. There are other uses of SVG. It's used in TV set-top boxes, mobile phones, predating smartphones, laser cutters. Found out recently that's also used in air traffic control systems. So it's used a lot of places, and not just on the web. So SVG2 is the next version, and if you're interested, you can follow along with the development by looking at the working draft and the editor's draft. They're listed here. So existing standard is SVG 1.1, and you can say it's being ripped apart. The CSS people have seen a lot of nice things that are in SVG, and they want them for HTML. So a lot of the modules, a lot of things are being removed, put into modules that are shared between SVG and HTML, CSS. And this is a good thing in that modules shared with CSS are more likely to be implemented quickly in the browsers. For example, CSS3 colors has already been implemented, and it works in SVG. Although being implemented in the browser for HTML doesn't necessarily mean it can be used by SVG right away. The rendering models are not quite the same. I understand the browser vendors are working on unifying them, so in the future, that problem will go away, hopefully. And it's not a good thing in that CSS HTML, the browser vendors dominate the group now. And we also have to worry about changes that we make that might affect the CSS module. We just can't do it ourselves anymore because we have to collaborate with the CSS group. So for example, there's a problem with scaling of bitmaps in SVG. Sometimes you want them to remain blocky, sometimes you want them to be smooth. And there's no flag right now to do that. And we can't just put a flag in ourselves, we have to coordinate with the CSS people. So here's kind of a structure of what CSS2 is going to look like. We have SVG 1.1 gets split into CSS3 modules plus SVG2. And so you kind of see the division, and my talk will kind of follow this division here. So let's start with color. CSS color level 3, it's already a recommendation, and it's already been implemented in the browser. So you see the blue squares there. There's a test square on the left and a reference square, what it's supposed to look like on the right. And you see I'm using Firefox nightly, and you can see it displays the blue like it's supposed to. And then I've tested Firefox, Chrome, and Inkscape, and depending upon the opacity of the logos, it tells you how far along each of those is in implementing that feature. So Inkscape doesn't do RGBA, where you have the ability to directly specify the alpha of a color. There are some additional SVG2 things that are in the SVG2 spec and not in color level 3, and those haven't been implemented by anybody yet. And some of those things might end up in CSS color level 4. So I don't really know where that's going to head. In SVG, there's a new solid color element. So you can develop a palette that you can then use everywhere in SVG. You can use it to specify the fill color. You can use it to specify a stop in a gradient, in a pattern. You can use it anywhere where you would normally use a color. And this Inkscape has implemented partly. It works for fills. It doesn't work inside gradients yet. Okay, another thing with color is there new fill and stroke properties: context fill paint, context stroke paint, and context color. And one of the main motivations for this is to solve a problem of getting a marker, that is the arrowhead, the fill color, to match the stroke color of the line the path is attached to. Before, or in SVG 1.1, every time you change the color of a line and you want the marker, the arrowhead, to match that color, you have to create a new marker. So with SVG 2, you'll just be able to say fill equal context stroke paint, and it'll happen automatically. Firefox does support this value, but currently it's limited to their implementation of SVG and OpenType. But I expect it to be supported by them throughout all of SVG pretty soon. And these values, they also not only work for markers, they work for patterns, gradients, etc. So you can get some color information into those features. Here's the CSS Compositing and Blending Level 1 module. It includes all the Porter-Duff compositing operators, but wait to the next slide before you get too excited about that. Advanced blending modes, compositing groups, and it's stylable via CSS. SVG 1.1 does simple alpha blending, and that's all the blending it does, unless you start using filters. And there are a few modes that you can do by filters, but that's kind of cumbersome. Okay, just compositing. It was originally in the spec to apply to SVG, but it's been postponed because I guess some of the browsers have implementation issues. So right now, the values, you can only use it in Canvas and not SVG. So let's get to blending, because that's a little more exciting, because there we see progress in implementations. SVG 1.1, objects are painted on top of each other. There's some blending available using filters: multiply, screen, darken, and lighten. But now in CSS3, we have additional blending modes, and you can do it via CSS. So here's an example of using blending by screen. And here's a test. The test is on the left. What's supposed to look like is on the right, and you can see that Firefox Nightly does it as expected. Chrome already does it, and Inkscape supports it in the trunk. When I talk about Inkscape, I'm talking about the trunk build, not in a release version. And yeah, you can use it. That's not work. This is Firefox Nightly. The animation. This is all declarative animation using the blend modes. The blend mode does slow down the animation. It would be smoother if that wasn't there. Okay. Oops, now how do I go backwards? Okay. So, as I said, this is available, or will be available in Firefox, Chrome, and Inkscape. Filter effects. Filter effects are something that came from SVG. They've been removed and put into their own specification. And basically, the specification defines SVG 1.1 filters plus some filter shorthands. So now you can apply SVG filters to your HTML content. The shorthands work in Chrome for HTML, but they don't work yet in SVG anywhere that I could find. but that should be coming soon. So the shorthands just make it much easier to use some very common filter combinations. Just a quick aside, this is a filter primitive that I would like to see in SVG, and that's a screening primitive. And perhaps that would go into a future version. You can do some nice things with it. For example, the one picture there contains 21,000 circles. You can't do that easily in a file. You wouldn't want to do it in a file. And it has some uses. For example, in cartography, you can control the density of your symbol placement by using a gradient. Okay. Here's another thing that's been taken out of SVG and put into a module: transforms, CSS transforms. And we can now style the transforms. And here are some examples. On the top, you have a rectangle that's rotating. Now you can see Firefox does handle the stylable transform, but it's making a mistake in the origin of where the transform is referenced from. So it shouldn't get a full transparent logo. Chrome does the right thing in this case. One thing that CSS transforms adds is 3D transforms, perspective transforms. And here you can see in Firefox you can already do that. Although the rendering is, well, actually that's not so bad, but the rendering can be a little bit jagged. So that's supported in Firefox. Chrome will rotate the image but won't put the perspective effect on. At least in my test I couldn't get it to work. And Inkscape doesn't support it yet. But that's a nice thing to have. And I have a little demo of what you can do again with a declarative animation perspective. You can see the pentagon in the back is smaller. There needs to be some work on the rendering quality here, but that's kind of fun to do. Okay. Text layout is being reworked completely, although it will be compatible with SVG 1.1 text layout. It's going to be based on CSS, and you can see it's quite complicated because here are 7 different modules that it's going to depend on, at least. There might even be more. And these modules are still in a state of flux. So what I'm going to show you may be changing in it may not be actually what you end up getting. So just a few notes about moving to CSS. SVG 1.1 text layout is practically the same as layout of a single line of CSS text. So there's really no reason to have to define text layout in SVG by itself. We can rely on this CSS modules for a lot of that. It's going to be backward compatible with SVG 1.1, but by explicitly calling out CSS, making it more, we make this dependence more explicit, and it makes it clear to the people that are working on the rendering engines that they don't have to have a special implementation just for SVG. They can just use what they are using for HTML and CSS. And this opens up the possibility for having auto-wrap text in SVG, something we've wanted for years. Something that was supposed to be in SVG 1.2, but SVG 1.2 was never finalized. And the way it's put in, if a browser doesn't support SVG 2 text, there is a possible way of doing it so that you can have an SVG 1.1 fallback solution. Now, the differences between SVG and CSS HTML is that SVG doesn't have a natural content area, which is provided in CSS by the box model. So we need to have some way of getting a place to put the text. Also, SVG doesn't have line breaking elements. Okay, there are 3 types of text layout in SVG 2. There's the pre-formatted text, which is the same thing as SVG 1.1 text, plus allowing the ability to have multiple lines. You know, SVG 1.1, you just can have one line of text. You can't have multiple lines within a text block. There'll be an auto wrap text possibility, and just like in SVG 1.1, you can have text on a path. So layout steps are, first of all, you lay out text according to CSS rules, assuming an infinitely wide or high content area. And then SVG does have some special things. You can move little pieces of text or letter characters around using X, Y, DY, DX. You can even rotate individual characters. So these get applied after the CSS layout. And then the way you lay out, traditionally the way you anchor, you align SVG text is using a text anchor property. So what's new, and this is pre-formatted text, is that you can get multi-line text using the white space property with values of which is preserve or preserve line. So here's an example where I've used preserve line. And you can see in the SVG that the text is broken and it's preserved in the browser. So this is already supported by Firefox and kind of supported in Inkscape. Then there's auto wrap text. If you explicitly give the text a content area, the text will auto wrap into that area. And there are two ways to define a content area. One is you just give it a width, which works for horizontal text, or a height for vertical text, such as you might find in Japanese or Chinese. Or you can set the shape inside property to define either a CSS basic shape or reference an SVG shape. So here's a way of getting text wrapping using the width attribute. You just set the width, and then the text automatically wraps. And the text begins exactly where it would begin normally for SVG. If it was just SVG 1.1, if you just had a single line of text. And then the content area is of infinite height, so you just keep on filling text until you get to the end. Another way of getting text in a rectangular area is to give the text a wrapping context. This is by using explicitly a rectangle, a CSS rectangle. The rectangle has been removed from CSS shapes level 1 and has been moved into a future specification, CSS shapes level 2. And then another way of getting a content area is to refer directly to a SVG shape, as is done here. I should also mention that the shape inside has been postponed to CSS shapes level 2. And you can add padding. So here I have a text in a circle with some padding. And you can exclude areas by using a shape outside. Here's an example of doing that. Okay, another thing that's being moved into CSS is text decorations. Actually, we already relied on SVG 1.1 on CS2. Text decorations, underline, line through, overline, and the blank that nobody supports anymore. CSS3 allows you to specify directly the color of the text decoration, the underline in this case here, and also specify whether the line should be wavy or dotted, or I think dashed too. I don't have a test for that. Inkscape partially supports this. These things are supported in HTML by the browsers, but not in SVG yet. SVG has a problem in that we don't just have one color that can be used for the line. We have a fill and a stroke. And so the working group, along with CSS, the CSS group, have to decide how we're going to handle that. How do I set the fill and stroke color on that? Because right now in CSS text decorations level 3, you can only specify a single color. So that's something that has to be resolved before we can get that into SVG. Now this is something that's very nice and has been asked for a long time, and that is to have a flexible paint order. In SVG 1.1, the stroke is always painted on the top. And this is not what you want if you want to try to outline text. As you can see here, the stroke on top makes the B look pretty horrible. What you want to be able to do is put the stroke behind. And there are ways of doing that. You can duplicate your text and have a stroke behind and then another copy on front, but it's a little bit complicated. So in SVG 2, we have a paint order property where you can specify, I want the stroke behind and I want the fill. You can even move the markers around. You can choose where you want them to appear. And this is supported now by Firefox, Chrome, and Inkscape, as you can see the test here of Firefox. There's a new line join. Every single graphics rendering engine for the last 30, 40 years has 3 types of line joins, a bevel, round, and miter. But for drawing, sometimes none of those look very good. And so we have a new line join type, extrapolate. I have a trial implementation in Cairo, but it requires some changes to the underlying rendering engine, which for Inkscape is Cairo. There are a couple things that may or may not end up in SVG2. Something that people would really like is variable stroke width. And this is in an exploration stage. I don't think this is going to make it in SVG2. It's just, there are too many problems. It seems easy at first, but you get into all kinds of problems when you talk about paths that have sharp angles in them or overlap each other. You know, how do you handle the width at those points? It's going to take some work. Something that I didn't think was going to make it into SVG2 until this last week is flexible stroke position. You choose where you position the stroke. Is it 50-50, inside, outside the line? Or is it all outside, or maybe 90% outside? There's a lot of interest in this, and if we can find an easy algorithm for doing this, that might make it into SVG2, but no promises. Something else that's probably going to make it into SVG2 is shared paths. 2 paths can share the same path data. Like if you have a map, you have 2 countries next to each other, you don't want to have to put that border in twice. By using shared paths, you just put it in once. And then one path will use it in one direction, and then the other path, the other country, will be able to reverse that path and use it to outline the country. And that actually has some advantages in that a renderer can know that this path is shared by 2 boundaries, and then you can solve some anti-aliasing problems with that. One idea was to use the paths at one point, allow different properties on them. I'm not sure that this current proposal that we have will allow that or not. Okay, that's something we're working on. That's not in any browsers or anywhere yet, implementation yet. Turning to markers, we have there's in the document SVG2 specification right now, there are marker cutouts. And we're still discussing exactly how to do this. This solves the problem of you define a line. Usually you want to define a line from point A to point B, and then you want to put an arrowhead on it. You want that arrowhead to end up at point A and point B. And currently in SVG, if you try doing that, the line will stick out a little bit on the point. So by using a cutout, the marker says, I don't want the line to be shown in this area. So there are 2 proposals, and maybe we'll have both. And my preferred method is a clip path. It's not really a clip path, it's an anti-clip path that's specified in the marker. And currently in the spec are knockout shapes. But so you can use some predefined shapes to determine what area on the line is not going to be shown. There's also new marker placements, middle segment, Right now, you can only place markers on the in and on the nodes at the end of each marker segment. Also, we'll be able to place markers arbitrarily along a path, not just at the start and end of path segments. And I'm not sure the state of implementation of this. I haven't tested it yet. Now, this is another nice one for markers is currently in SVG 1.1, if you want to have a start arrow and an end arrow, you have to have two arrow definitions in your file. Now we have a new property for marker orientation called auto start reverse that will automatically reverse the orientation of a marker at the start of a path. And you can see this is already implemented in Firefox and in Inkscape. There's also markers on shapes. We've specified exactly how markers should end up on shapes. Inkscape implements it, but only by accident right now. Just the way the rendering engine works. And some work needs to be done. Okay, hatched fills. Hatches are something that have been in a lot of drawing languages for a long time, but they haven't been in SVG 2. So a common way of shading shapes, technical drawings, and maps. You can simulate in SVG 1.1 this by patterns, but you're subject to anomalies at the pattern boundaries. And it's especially problematic for people that are using SVG to drive plotters and engravers, because every time you come to the end of a pattern, the pen goes up, pen goes down, or the engraving thing goes up or down, and you're left with a little mark that you don't want. So here is an example of how you define a hatch. You can very simply define an offset, and then you get straight lines. You can control the angle. You can have more complicated patterns. You can use dashes on one line. You can have squiggly lines, disconnected lines if that's what you want. And here's a test. Inkscape has an implementation of this now, not in the trunk, but in another repository. But we have this now, and that should be going in hopefully the next few months. The other thing is, it's very nice when you start talking about hatches, if you want to cross hatches, that you use the same hatch pattern and you just rotate it. So this got us thinking about the idea that maybe it'd be nice to have multiple fills in a shape. So we have in SVG 2 there will be multiple fills. I'm not sure anybody implements that yet. This is also, you can have a background color and then put your hatch on top, or pattern, or whatever you want. Talk about mesh gradients. Mesh gradients have been something that we've wanted for a long time because they allow you to have smooth color variations along curved paths, arbitrary paths. And that's important to have lifelike vector art, 3D lighting effects, for fills that follow curves. One can simulate this with linear and radial gradients and Gaussian blurs, but it's hard. We had some discussions about what was required. We went through and looked at different kinds of gradients. The diffusion curves that you heard a couple days ago in a talk by Nikos. But we chose Coons patch mesh gradients. Why? Because they're easy for content creators to use, at least the tools, the way you can, the tools, you can divide up rows easily. They're easy to manipulate. Maybe not by hand, but in Inkscape or Illustrator. And they're straightforward to implement. They're mature technology. They're in PostScript, they're in PDF, they're in the rendering libraries like Poplar and Cairo. They all have this there already. So it's well known how to do them, whereas with diffusion curves, it's not really sure the best way of rendering them. So we have this in Inkscape. We even have interface for drawing. Although it's hidden behind a compile time flag, it's kind of buggy. But I did this copy of a red pepper in about an hour with a buggy version, one that crashed a few times, and you couldn't just hit undo, didn't work. So I think if those things are fixed, you could probably do this in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So there is one problem that we still have to address. This is a Coons patch. Is basically you define the color at the four corners, and it gets blended in between, and then you can manipulate the square there. You can kind of control the flow of the color inside, but not very well. In one dimension, this is the same. A mesh is the same as a linear gradient, consisting of the two patches would be a linear gradient consisting of 3 stops. And the thing to note is the color transition between the two patches is continuous, but it's not smooth. You have a sharp point here and there. And you might not think that's a problem, but it turns out it is, because your eye works in a complicated way. Your eye is tuned to look for those kinds of sharp transitions. And you can see, for example, here, this color is smooth, but because of the break in the curve here, your eye picks that out and it makes it look lighter. You can manipulate the mesh handles. In one dimension it works fine, but in 2 dimension it doesn't really work. Now you can add tensor points, and I think we will end up with tensor points, which allow you to control a little bit of the flow of the color inside those squares. It helps, but it's not perfect. Now others like Adobe and CorelDRAW handle this by presenting what looks to the person using the tool a 2x2 patch, mesh patch. But in actuality, when it's drawn, there are 256 patches in there. So they're not using a linear interpolation between the colors. They're actually using something a little more complicated. And we've pretty much figured it out what they're doing. I'll skip that one. Okay. And I would like to see SVG have something that specifies I want to use some kind of interpolation other than the default interpolation in order to get nice, smooth transitions. Skip that. Okay, what other stuff is coming into SVG2? Well, there's some things that are not going to make it in SVG2, and some things will be handled by other modules. One thing that, if you were at the talks yesterday, Cameron showed SVG in OpenType. Oh, and I should remove that. It's no longer in Firefox under a flag. You can use it directly in Firefox now. Actually, my demo's not going to work because it's offline. We've debated shapes, regular shapes and stars. I don't think that's going to happen in SVG2, maybe in a future version. Connectors. It'd be nice to have an ability to connect objects automatically. It shows relationships between objects, so there's some semantics in there. This is something that a lot of people are interested in, but will probably happen in a separate module. And there's something that I would like to see eventually, and that's warp text. You can already put text on a line in SVG, but it'd be nice to be able to control both the top and the bottom. Something I didn't put in the talk that we recently decided on is if you use symbols, as map makers do often, you can now set a reference point on the symbol. So it'll align where you want it to align. You won't have to manually say, I want it here, okay, now, but the symbols can only be referenced by the corner, so now I have to shift it. We'll have reference points in the symbol itself. And, well, the SVG working group is making quick progress with SVG2, but there's a lot to do. It's a small group, and if you have opinions about any of this, you should let the working group members know about it, because your opinion does matter. Okay, thank you.
We have a couple minutes of questions, so I'm very much looking forward to using all of this.
Tell the browser vendors that.
So, yeah.
Good question. common. They tend to be lagging and...
Well, they are lagging. In fact, the person that was representing them at our last meeting said basically we're going to wait and see what people want, what people are using. He said basically we're going to see what people are using. So it's kind of a problem because it's a chicken and egg problem, you know.
I also work for a government organization, and they recently migrated to Coons. There's something happening.
So you didn't mention Safari, but it's like all
Oh, I mentioned what?
Safari.
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 Yeah, I don't have the ability to test Safari. And it takes a lot of work to test each one, for each of these things. You have to make sure you've got, you're not using like a nightly build, or you don't have certain flags turned on. Because there's a lot of trial implementations of some of these things. They're behind flags, and so just testing 3 things was enough for me, and I don't have a Apple computer, so. And they tend to run a little bit late. They're not as bad as Internet Explorer. But
You mentioned the possibility of having multiple fills in the
Mhm.
same shape. Do you know, what's the discussion about that? Like, if you had multiple fills, would they be stacked like in current SVG, like later things come on top?
Well, we just discussed this at our meeting last week, and there is a proposal to actually allow blending. Within the fill or the stroke, you could specify a series of things that are stacked in SVG2, but you could also specify a blend mode. But we'll see.
Super helpful, yeah.
So that's something you want. So you should you've let me know, but.
So I'll think about it. I don't know if I want it so badly that you should work a lot on it, but it sounds
So
think about it.
the model we're going to have in the spec, and I think might have been added by Dirk already into the spec, is to follow background image layers. So we'll use the same sort of ordering. The fill and stroke properties will have the same sort of syntax as the background shorthand, basically.
So I have one question. With HTML, you see that the new stuff is added gradually, and it's not like added all at once. That's the way you're going to go with SVG as well.
Yeah.
So that we don't have to wait until SVG2 is totally finished in the spec to see the problems.
No, if something is we think is kind of fixed, then if the browser vendors are interested in that, and that's not always 100% sure, it'll be implemented.
So if there's no big discussion, we will, and there's enough interest, we will.
Sorry, one other question. Maybe it is outside of the scope of this presentation, but I've heard from other people at this conference, like, look, if there are things you want implemented, like, pressure the browser makers, but is there, I know this isn't the fun part to talk about, but what about, like, the politics of this process? Like, is somebody managing, like, an organized effort to apply that pressure? Or, like, how do we get people involved so that they can communicate, these features would be really valuable, can you please implement this?
Talk to members of the working group. There is a mailing list too. Send emails to that.
And there's going to be a whole panel about standards
Later
and that's probably a good question to ask them.
Yeah, because not all the working group members that are here at the conference are in this talk, so that would be a good time to.
But it's not just the people in the working group who want to engage, right? It's the people who are managing the browser.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how to reach those.
Let's talk about it during the panel.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a good question. It's a very good question.
Well, I guess, are there more pressing questions now? Otherwise, there will still be the panel to discuss more of these things.